Welcome, everybody. This is Dr. Andrew Newberg. We're so glad that you could make it. My name is Bob Williams. I'm Dr. Andrew's publicist, and we're working together on this exciting new project of his, a book called Sex, God, and the Brain. And so we'll go ahead and get started with a short little video that we recently made to promote the book.
Almost all animal rituals are basically mating rituals. And obviously, if you don't do this, well, the species doesn't continue. I'm Dr. Andrew Newberg, and I'm here to talk today about my latest book, Sex, God, and the Brain. When you look at a lot of orthodox perspectives, there seems to be this sense that we need to forego the sexual in order to engage the spiritual. From the moment that human beings are made, God tells us to be fruitful and multiply. Since the evidence seems to suggest that there is a great deal of overlap, it may be possible to find ways of truly embracing both the sexual and the spiritual. Those very, very powerful feelings of connectedness and oneness seem to be associated with these changes that are going on in the parietal lobe. And sometimes it can become one with the group, it could become one with God, it could become one with the universe. And that area of the brain is also affected in sexual experiences as well. So if this area of the brain normally turns on to give us our sense of self, then when this area of the brain starts to quiet down, we lose that sense of self. These kinds of research studies are a little bit like walking on the moon for the first time. I mean, no one really knows what it's going to be like, and no one's done it before. As we do more and more research, we'll see greater engagement in the scientific community to help all people who are challenged and dealing with issues that are kind of fundamental to who they are.
Well, thank you for joining us, Dr. Andrew. I'll first do a little introduction to Dr. Andrew Newberg, and then we'll go ahead and get started with this exciting discussion around this new book. So Dr. Andrew Newberg is the Director of Research at the Marcus Institute of Integrative Health and a physician at Jefferson University Hospital. He's board certified in internal and nuclear medicine. His research focuses on the relationship between the brain function and various mental states, particularly religious and mystical experiences, and has included brain scans during prayer, meditation, as well as studies on aging, dementia, and other neurological disorders. Dr. Andrew Newberg conducted a groundbreaking study of the impact of orgasmic meditation on the brain using PET and fMRI technology, and has published over 250 peer-reviewed articles and 14 books, presented his work globally, and appeared on numerous media platforms. I hope that isn't too much of a mouthful, Dr. Andy, but we're so glad to have you here. And this is an exciting new book. Tell us how it all came to be.
Wow. Well, thank you so much. And thanks for everyone who's here. I love sharing these ideas and certainly love to hear from everyone about their own perspectives on things. So I hope to continue to connect with everybody as the whole process unfolds. This has been a very exciting project for me. It's actually something that it literally has been about 30 years in the making. Many, many years ago, when I first started to get into the study of religious and spiritual phenomena and experiences, I had the wonderful good fortune to have a terrific mentor by the name of Dr. Eugene DeQuilly, who was a psychiatrist at the University of Pennsylvania, where I was. And he also had a PhD in anthropology. And he had often looked at the relationship between the brain and our religious and spiritual selves. And right around the time that I connected with him, we started to kind of expand what we were doing in terms of the areas of the brain that were involved. But interestingly, there was always this piece that connected sexuality to spirituality, because as an anthropologist, he had always surmised that, well, if you kind of take an evolutionary perspective, that the rituals that occur in the human brain, particularly the rituals that surround, well, everything that we do, we have rituals in almost every aspect of our lives, but particularly religious and spiritual rituals, if they evolved in the human brain, well, they had to come from somewhere. They had to come from animal rituals. That would make some sense from an evolutionary perspective. But the key piece to that is, what exactly are animal rituals? Well, all animal rituals are sexual rituals. They're mating rituals. They help animals come together so that they can connect and ultimately procreate and continue the species. So mating rituals are essential for virtually every species on the planet and for hundreds of millions of years. Ultimately, that whole process evolved into the complex workings of the human brain. So we always kind of knew that there was this tie-in, but we never had the opportunity to really test it. And that's what ultimately kind of came about that brought this book about, which was the ability to study a practice like orgasmic meditation, where we could actually see what's going on in the brain when a combination of sexual activity and spiritual activity kind of come together, and help us to learn and pick apart what are the areas of the brain that are involved. And as that video just showed, part of what the ultimate conclusion of all of this is, which I think supports the original ideas that we had 30 years ago, is that the areas of the brain that underlie sexuality are essentially the same as the ones that underlie spirituality. And so there is an intimate connection here that is what kind of blossomed into this entire book project that talks about all of those connections, and then how they really become a part of almost every aspect of human life, from our social interactions to our moral thought processes to political systems. All the things that make us who we are as human beings, our creative processes, really derive from this intimate connection between spirituality and sexuality.
Amazing. Thank you. So you have this, you see this connection, you have these conversations with your mentor, Dr. Gene. I loved reading in the book the stories of your dinners at the barn in Pennsylvania. Tell us a little bit about how he in particular noticed that connection noticed that connection, and then how you how that became really a centerpiece of your curiosity and your scientific research.
Well, when I first met Gene DeQuille, I mean, he became a wonderful mentor of mine and incredibly generous. He was probably one of the most brilliant human beings that I have ever known. As I mentioned, he was an MD, he was a psychiatrist, he had a PhD in anthropology, spoke about 4 or 5 different languages, including Latin and French, knew everything there was about pretty much every topic under the sun, and was particularly keen on the relationship between rituals and humanity, and how the rituals, he loved rituals, and the rituals that were part of religious and spiritual practices, the songs, the ordering of the services, the way prayers are done and so forth, the way holidays are celebrated, because these rituals really kind of ground us and connect us, and they're really fundamental to who we are as human beings. But he kind of noticed and brought into all of this idea that there was this fundamental connection between the rituals and animals that he started to study, and how that ultimately became connected with the rituals in human beings. And we would sit around this dinner table, as you mentioned. I mean, as a wide-eyed, young medical student, I'd be sitting at a table where, in addition to Gene DeQuille, who I thought was the most brilliant person I had ever met, were literally Nobel laureates who were sitting next to us, people who basically invented modern psychotherapy, psychiatrists who were just fundamental to the entire field. So I'm sitting around with these luminaries, and part of what was fun about it was that we would be engaging in rituals themselves. His dinner parties were just one big ritual, from the moment that you walked in to sitting around, a fire talking about rituals, to the different songs that we would actually sing around the table, watching these, Nobel Prize winners sing drinking songs, and so forth. I even was reflecting on when you came for the first time, one of the rituals was that he would ask you to consume a drink called Fernet Branca. I'm not sure how many of you are even familiar with that, but it's an Italian bitters. It's like this black liquid that's basically poison. But he would, force you to drink that. And it was just, again, it was all of these different connections of the rituals all together that he had been working on, and he had been exploring as part of his own work, that when I finally connected with him back in the early 1990s, I realized the brilliance of that concept, But we started to do brain scan studies, and I know we'll talk about that in a moment, but different brain scan studies of all different kinds of ritualistic practices, various religious and spiritual practices like meditation and prayer. And then, of course, part of what was heartbreaking for me, literally and figuratively, was that Gene died very suddenly after I'd been working with him for about 6 or 7 years of a heart attack. And because I was not from the anthropological background, it was a little hard for me to keep coming back to that relationship between sexuality and spirituality. So I kind of kept going, but started to talk more and more about the neuroscience, knowing that I would always want to come back to that someday. And this is where, I finally had to wait 30 years for myself to be able to do that. But it's so exciting to finally find the neuroscience and the anthropology and all of this stuff coming together all in one spot. And that to me is what has made this project so exciting. And so really, I hope very rewarding to be able to share with everyone.
Yeah, that's amazing. So you had this history with the topic that's really fascinating. You've told me also that you've been fascinated with the mystical state and things that are beyond I guess beyond human since you were a child. So fast forward to you get a phone call in your back office. Tell me a little bit about that story and what that set you off in your research on the path.
Yeah, so as you mentioned in my introduction, a lot of my career was very traditional. It was doing neuroimaging studies through the field of nuclear medicine, which basically involves injecting different radioactive tracers to look at the brain's physiology. And we would study Parkinson's and depression and Alzheimer's and all different kinds of neurological and psychological issues that people face. But I had also, because of the work with Gene D'Aquili, started, there was that proverbial light bulb that went off at one point where I said, gee, if we're doing brain scans of religious practices and meditation practices and so forth, or excuse me, if we're doing brain scans of Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's, why can't we do brain scans of people who are engaged in religious and spiritual practices? So we started to do that. We started to do research studies on all different kinds of traditions, all different kinds of practices, prayer practices, meditation practices. We studied Brazilian mediums speaking in tongues. We studied Pentecostal Christians, Pentecostal Christians speaking in tongues. We studied Brazilian mediums engaged in trance states and so forth. And so, as you mentioned, at one point, I was sitting in my office, and as often has happened, I'll get a call kind of out of the blue from someone who has maybe something to offer. You never fully know. But it was a very intelligent, very pleasant young woman on the other side of the phone, and she said, I've been following a lot of your work that you've been doing. We do a practice called orgasmic meditation. And, she wondered, had I heard about it? I said, no, I hadn't really heard about it before. And I said, well, tell me a little bit about it. What is it? And how does it done? And she started to explain to me a little bit about what the orgasmic meditation practice was, how it worked. And I was very intrigued for two main reasons. One was that it seemed that it had this very clear and concise approach, which was actually very helpful and very positive in my view, because many times when I study a practice, it's much looser. When we studied Buddhist meditators, I would have a conversation with them. Well, how long are you going to do this practice? When do we do a brain scan? And they would say, well, I could be doing it for 45 minutes. I could do it for, an hour. I could do it for 20 minutes. And that's hard for me as a researcher. But this practice is very short. It's 15 minutes. It's it's all very well designed. And to me, as in terms of doing a research study, it seemed like it was something that really had an opportunity to be able to be more easily studied than a lot of the other practices that I had looked at. But the other piece that was going on in the back of my mind was this prior discussion that we had with, gee, this is a little bit of, could this be this little missing link that I have been looking for many, many years, that looks to find a way of bringing together something that has a sexual element to it with something that has a spiritual element. And I was very intrigued by the idea that when people were doing orgasmic meditation, that the goal was not a sexual experience, even though there's the use of that sexual energy, but that it's really about a meditative practice, a meditative experience, a spiritual feeling that people get. And I could tell even in the description, where she was going with this whole thing in terms of that kind of spiritual, mystical elements to it that sounded so much like many of the spiritual experiences that I had been studying over the years. So, I immediately was very intrigued by that. I actually explained to her my background in looking at these kinds of questions and looking at this relationship. So I don't think she even knew that at the time. So she was, she thought I just did studies of this because I was just studying meditation and religious experiences, didn't realize that there was this whole other piece to it that really went back 30 years. So that is what kind of led us to ultimately being able to design a study and being able to execute it and get some fascinating results that led us to being able to put the book project together by looking at that data and seeing how that sexuality and spirituality are so interwoven within our biology.
Beautiful. Yeah. So let's get into the study a little bit. Tell us first a brief description of how the study was designed and conducted, and then let's get into what you saw and what you noticed in it.
Well, as I guess geeking out is the term that gets used these days. I get very excited about methodology, and all of these studies are very challenging. You have to think about, well, what is the person doing? How is the practice unfold? When does it unfold? What are the elements of it? And by elements, I mean, are people lying still? Are they seated? Are they have their eyes closed, open? Are they breathing? Are they, what are they focusing on? So you have to get a lot of information about any study, and of course, orgasmic meditation, again, very nice because it's very prescribed and there's clear elements to it, but those elements also made it a bit challenging as well. So one of the main ones, and this again is something that has certainly come up for me before, is whether a practice could actually be done while somebody is in a scanner versus whether they need to kind of be outside of the scanner and kind of use the scanner to evaluate the state later. And interestingly, a lot of our studies have been like that. There are a few practices where you can do meditation and just lie down, and I can put somebody into an MRI scanner and ask them to do the practice, and they can just do it in that scanner without moving or anything like that. But there are many practices, and I mentioned speaking in tongues there. The person is moving around and dancing around and shaking their hands and speaking and so forth. So that's not something that can be done in the scanner environment. That's something that has to be done outside of the scanner. And so I was certainly very familiar with being able to do that. Orgasmic meditation certainly posed that kind of a challenge. As many of the people on the webinar know, it's a paired practice. So somehow I've got to get two people involved in this process and deal with that with the scanner. And of course, part of what's also fascinating to me about the practice as a paired practice is that, gee, it'd be really interesting to study both people who are involved in this practice, not just one. Well, I can only scan one person at a time. So again, there were different issues that we had to deal with in terms of how were we going to do it? When were we going to do it? And what we ultimately kind of settled on was the idea of getting people to get themselves into a room that we kind of set aside. We closed off. We created an area where people could do the practice in the relatively normal setting, which in and of itself is always a challenge too, which is, are you able to get into an experience and get into a practice in a way that actually, facilitates what is normally perceived and normally experienced. So we were able to do all of that in a special, separate room that we put together. And we decided to use a kind of imaging called PET imaging, which is very similar to some of the other studies that we've done, where you basically inject people with a little bit of a radioactive tracer that circulates in a few minutes, gets up into the brain, and for all intents and purposes, kind of gets locked into the brain. So it creates a snapshot, if you will, of what the brain is doing at any given moment in time. So if I were to inject somebody who's watching this program right now, and then we finished it, and then a half hour later, they got a little snack, and then they went down to their local hospital and got into the scanner, it would be telling me what their brain was doing right now. And so that was why it really worked well for being able to study a practice like orgasmic meditation, which is that we could actually have the people in the room doing the practice. We had an intravenous line that was connected to them so that I could then go over to them while they were in the midst of the practice. And then I could, again, behind a screen, so I wasn't disturbing the practice at all, inject a little bit of this tracer there and be able to see exactly, and then bring them, after they finished the meditation practice, the tracer would show me what was going on, get into the brain where it was being used during the meditation practice itself, but I could put them into the scanner later and it would give me the snapshot of exactly what was going on at the moment of the practice. So we were able to do all of that by setting up the study that way and being able to capture not what was going on after the practice, but actually during the practice itself. And because we had the two individuals involved in the practice, we could actually inject both of them at the same time, but we could scan them later. We could scan them one at a time, and it would show me what was going on in both of their brains so that we can see how this particular practice affected people.
Amazing. So you have this lifelong theory that you've been working on, that sexuality and religion in particular, come from the mating rituals of animals and then humans, and that there's shared neurological components to that, right?
Right.
What did you notice tell us what the results of the OM study showed and how that relates to your theory?
Well, so there's a couple of really important things that rituals are doing for us. So I think it's important to start with that. And I've mentioned already that there's this connection, but now we need to, before we get into, well, what do we see on the scans? This is the question that to me was really at the heart of everything that we were trying to look at from both a theoretical perspective and now as an empirical with data. So what do rituals do for us? Well, rituals do two main things, I think. Well, first of all, they are rhythmic patterned activities. So, and that can extend into many different kinds of practices. But sticking with these kinds of rituals, what do they generally do? I mentioned that they ground us. Well, what do? They really connect us to something. They connect us to an idea. They connect us to a group. They connect us to the world, to humanity, to the universe, to God, whatever it is that you feel connected to. Rituals help to do that. And in that original video that you showed, one of the areas of the brain that I talked about, the parietal lobe, which is located in the back part of the brain. So this is an area that takes sensory information and helps us to construct the spatial representation of ourself. And for the most part, us, as well as virtually all animals, we live an individual life. We go through the world, we are ourselves, and we kind of distinguish us, our own self from the rest of the world. It's me versus everything else. And that's crucial. I need to be able to, when I'm done here, to be able to walk out of the room, I need to know where I am, and I need to know where the doorway is, and I need to make sure I walk through the doorway. I don't step on anything that's on the floor. So my spatial processes are helping me to establish where I am and where I need to go. So what happens during rituals? Well, they basically, through these rhythmic processes, affect this particular part of the brain, the parietal lobe, and it starts to quiet down. In fact, what seems to happen is that it starts to reduce the amount of sensory information that the parietal lobe has to work on. So if the parietal lobe turns on to give us our sense of self, as the parietal lobe activity begins to fall away, we lose that sense of self and we start to feel connected. We blur the boundary between ourself and something else. And in the case of a practice like orgasmic meditation, it may be between ourself and the other person who we are engaged in the practice with. If we are sitting in a house of worship, it could be a connection with the congregation. And it can also be with ideas. So it can be, a specific tradition. If you are Catholic, if you're Jewish, if you're Muslim, whatever, you feel connected to the belief system. You may feel connected to the entire group of human beings that are part of that group. And again, if you go kind of, far enough, so to speak, you can feel a sense of oneness with everything, the universe, with God, whatever it is that you feel connected to. So that sense of connection is fundamental. And of course, from the perspective of a mating ritual, the basic thing is to connect the two animals together, to allow two animals to come together, to break down those boundaries so that the two animals can come together, be connected, and be connected long enough so they can mate and make the next generation of the species. So that very fundamental being connected to something, which is part of the mating ritual and part of sexuality, that feeling, that incredible feeling of connectedness that we feel, becomes now part of all the rituals that have become part of humanity, and particularly religious and spiritual rituals. So that sense of connection is part, is one very critical part of what rituals do. And the other part is the identification process, which is that on the animal world, you want to mate with a member of your species. So, it's very important that, if you're an elk, you don't try mating with a lion. That is not going to go well. So you want to be mating with other members of your species, and part of how you do that is by identification, and that's part of what the rituals do through that kind of paired process, which is also what we see in the orgasmic meditation. So the more you are able to kind of engage in that dance, you create that sense of resonance. And again, we can see that on the animal level, that two animal, there are many different complex rituals in the animal kingdom, the way they move, the way they flap their wings, the way they move around each other. I was just looking at a video about two eagles where they connect their talons in the middle, and they actually do like cartwheels as they're flying around. I mean, crazy. What looks crazy to us, but that's what connects them, and that's also what identifies them. And just as in human beings, when we meet somebody for the first time, we're striving for that resonance. Do we have that connection with the person? Can we identify with that person? That's what ultimately kind of creates that sense of connectivity to it. So it's the identification and the connection. And the connectivity, we believe, happens in large part through parts of the social network of the brain, which enables us to feel what somebody else is feeling. And that's a very fundamental part of rituals. And as I came to learn, and as we showed in our brain scan studies of orgasmic meditation, that there is this ability to kind of form that sense of resonance. It's not just that you're in a, it's not just two people who are kind of, looking at each other, but they are really intimately connecting with each other. They're trying to be empathic. They're trying to understand what the other person is doing. And as a person does that sense of neural resonance that connects their brains to each other is part of what gets connected throughout that ritualistic process. So, and then again, jumping to the religious and the spiritual, part of what we are also then identifying with is the ideology, which is, connecting to a certain tradition, a certain ideology, a certain sacred text, a certain holiday, whatever it is that we feel connected to. We make the connection, and we also understand what we are being connected to. So what we saw in the brain scan studies of orgasmic meditation really paralleled what goes on in many other rituals, but is showing how it kind of connects that sexual piece to the spiritual piece as well, that sense of connectedness and that sense of identification that is so fundamental to all the rituals that make up the religious and spiritual rituals of human beings.
Right. And so one of the unique properties that you've talked about is, is there with the orgasmic meditation practice, you see both that level of connection that happens when the two brains are connect. And then there's also a resonance that happens. It makes me think of, our current state of, let's say the universe or the body politic, and where, I think the Surgeon General a couple of years ago or a year ago designated isolation and loneliness as an epidemic. So what do you see as, as a practice like Om, how do you see it functioning in improving the world?
Well, I think a lot of these practices, because of the ritualistic elements to them and that sense of creating that connection, it really kind of addresses that very point that you make. And what is important, though, for I think everyone to realize, and we see this again, I talk about this in the book, about not just the rituals, but the mythic elements, the storylines that go behind the rituals themselves. And so part of that has to do with not just the connection one-on-one with somebody, but how that then gets extrapolated to a larger connection with society, with our community, with the society, with a country, with the world, all of humanity, the universe. And so I think part of what we can see is that when it comes to a practice like orgasmic meditation, or again, many other rituals that help people to feel that sense of connection and connection to something greater than the self, it really can help people with that feeling of isolation. And I think what's important about that is that a practice could be just between it could be just a single individual, or in the case of orgasmic meditation, could be between two people who can quote unquote be isolated in the sense that they're just doing it themselves. But the embodied story, the embodied mythic elements of it can be connecting us to a much greater society, and a much greater, something that is greater than the self. So I think through those kinds of processes, we can see whether or not these practices can lead to a greater sense of inclusivity, a greater sense of empathy and compassion for all people. And in fact, I mean, in many ways, that to me has been one of the big take-home messages of a lot of the research which I have done, which is that as people come in to have me do brain scans of these different practices, are we able to see, or what I'm able to see is that the genuineness with which people come in, and it's given me a tremendous appreciation for how powerful these practices are for people, and how they really can make those people feel connected to something greater than the self. And so I think all of these practices have been shown over the years to have beneficial effects in terms of the brain, in terms of reducing anxiety, in terms of reducing stress, in terms of increasing our sense of social connectivity, feelings of empathy, and so forth. So all these different elements become a very critical part of these practices. And part of what we also were able to observe specifically in the orgasmic meditation practice, but also with some of the other practices that we've looked at, is that the effects seem to occur not only during the practice, but actually seem to change the brain over time. And in actually one of the most recent articles that we are now getting published, what we showed was that the people who had done the orgasmic meditation over time had differences in their brain compared to people who were non-meditators. And so when we look at that kind of a change, and those occurred in areas that are involved in social connectivity, and some of these areas that have some weird names like precuneus and insula, what they do is they help us with social interactions. They help us to perceive what other people are thinking about and feeling about. And these were areas of the brain that were just fundamentally different in people, not while they were meditating, but this was based on the resting scans that we did of the people who were involved in our practice. So that also speaks to the idea of how these kinds of practices, and orgasmic meditation in particular, is able to change a person over time, and hopefully help people to manage that kind of social isolation in a more effective way. And I think that hopefully future studies will be able to show how different kinds of practices can be effective like that. And as someone in the world of integrative medicine, there's never a one size fits all, but when somebody can find a practice that works best for them, it can have a very powerful effect. And we are starting to see that and show that through the imaging studies that we have.
Thank you. So I've got a good one for you here. And
Okay.
as you know, we are in the middle of an election cycle. And so there's a debate tonight. And I thought we could talk a little bit about what you see in nature and hierarchy, and how that relates to your work.
Well, one of the things I talk a lot about in the book is, it goes beyond just religious and spiritual rituals and practices and experiences, but sexuality, and the intersection between sexuality and spirituality really inundates all aspects of human life. And as you mentioned, it can be political, it can be social, it can be education, sports. I mean, all the different ways in which we kind of connect with people. But one of the really interesting ones, that I think a lot about, especially in the context of politics, is that a few years back, I was involved in a think group that was looking at the idea of worship. And it occurred to me that there was this interesting parallel between sexuality and the hierarchy that arises in animals, to the hierarchies that arise in human beings. And so in animals and many species, there is either an alpha male or there is a queen bee of some kind. But the bottom line is that there's a hierarchical structure of the group, and there is some, one of the members is at the top. And in fact, everybody kind of has a little bit of a sense of where they fit in that hierarchy. But what's interesting in particular about the one at the very top is that one really kind of controls the overall structure of the group. And there is a sense of deference to that leader, that there is a sense of worship, if you will. And that becomes very fundamental because if one of the things that's kind of interesting to me about this is that when you have this alpha male, I'll just use that example, there may be a challenge to that alpha male. And if the challenger loses, theoretically, I always think, well, why don't they just challenge again? If they were close enough, maybe they could just do it again. But that becomes very destabilizing. And so usually if a challenger loses, they then kind of reduce themselves in terms of the hierarchical structure. And there needs to be a reasonable degree of stability at the top. Otherwise, the whole structure just never really, gets grounded and stays together. So now, take that to humanity and think about, the ancient civilizations and the pharaohs of Egypt and the kings of, the Caesars of Rome and the kings of the ancient world, all the way up to the kings of medieval and almost modern time. There is a sense that they're worshipped. They're at this top of this hierarchy. If we keep, and there needs to be a certain degree of stability. In fact, just reflecting on the United States, if we had an election if we had to switch a president every 6 months, our country wouldn't work. I mean, there's just no way it would stay stable. The idea of having a president for 4 years or 8 years, it creates a stability that seems to be very, very important. So, it's just fascinating, looking at what's going on and saying, okay, well, this kind of makes sense. People kind of worship those leaders, and people get, as we see through the polls, the identification that people have, the connection that people have. And that's part of why you see, when you go to a political rally, they're ritualistic all the way, up and down, and they're singing songs and they're swaying in certain ways, and they make these impassioned speeches, and and they get people thinking about the ideas and the stories, and they tug at their emotions and so forth. So that really is real fundamental to how we as human beings work. And it really speaks to this idea of creating a kind of hierarchical structure with some member at the top that has to have a reasonable degree of stability, but also the ability to challenge that top. And so this is what we see. And of course, in my mind, part of why I got into all of this in the first place was, I was just always so struck by the fact that people had different religions, people believed in different political parties, and with such fervor and with such dedication. And they just absolutely knew that they were right and everyone else was wrong. It's pretty incredible when you think about that from a kind of philosophical perspective. And, as you mentioned at one point, some of my earliest thinkings on all of this came as a child, just like, well, if we're all looking at the same world, why don't we all see the things the same way? But we don't. And actually, when you actually think about the incredible complexities of our brain, that our genetics, how we were raised, what our parents were like, the friends we had, the teachers we had, the different good and bad experiences that we all had in our lives that bring us to today. It isn't a surprise that we all have different ideas and different thoughts about the world. As I often like to say, if there's 8 billion people on the planet, well, there's 8 billion religious belief systems, there's 8 billion political systems. No two people think of the world exactly the same way. And that's what this research also kind of bears out. But it helps us to understand it in the context of the rituals, the mythic stories that we fall to in order to understand our world, and the ways in which we interact with each other through these different kinds of ritualistic practices.
Thanks, Andy. Okay, everybody, we've got a couple of virtual hands right now. And if you'd like to ask Dr. Andrew a question, you can either put your question in the chat or raise your virtual hand, and we will go ahead and get started with our first question. We'll just do about 10 minutes. So hopefully we can get a few of you in here. So we'll start with, it looks like Uzo. I hope I said your name right.
Yes, that's correct. Hi.
Hi, how are you?
Pretty good. Awesome topic and interesting, especially in the context of medicine, studying something like this. So, what's coming up for me as I hear you is the context uh, under which all of this is interpreted. So, I think about two books in particular. One was The Immortality Key by, I believe it's Brian Morescu. I don't know if you've read that book. It talks
I've
about
seen it.
okay, it talks about like before, so pre-Christianity, pre-Abrahamic religions.
Hmm.
There was a lot of goddess worship. There was
Right.
goddesses, and it was also a lot of the spiritual practices were around psychedelics and also around orgies or like sexual practices. Like that was the base of spirituality in those times.
Right.
And then the second book is a book called The Chalice and the Blade. And it also talks about, well, this book mainly talks about the time before Christianity and the Abrahamic religions, where it was more a matrilineal society, where power was more not domination as we have today, but it was more, how did they say? I think they call it a partnership,
Hmm.
how they said it.
Right.
Like all those contexts are very different from what we have today. And
Correct.
I see that what they have in common is definitely feminine and also this kind of sexuality that is a basis of like it's like goodness and moral like human connection, where today there is definitely a conflict between religion and sexuality, which seems to maybe result from trying to shut down those practices. So I wonder if do you think that if you looked at your studies in that context versus in the context of today of domination of this kind of patrilineal way of being, which is domination, how does that? What do you think would be different in like the conclusions that you come to?
Well, that's a great question. Actually, in many ways, you almost summarized other parts of my book because I do talk a lot about, I do include sections about matriarchal versus patriarchal societies. It actually you said it perfectly. I mean, many of the ancient traditions really started with a more feministic perspective, fertility, just the whole idea of that we come from Mother Earth. And so, yeah, so I think that, I kind of cover all of those different ideas and try to address them. And it becomes very complex. And there's been some theorizing about exactly how this more patriarchal, society and approach and this kind of top down started to occur when you started to have ownership of land and ownership of resources, and then the fighting over those resources as opposed to the sharing. And so, I talk about some of those things as well. And yeah, I mean, I think that what's interesting is that in some ways, the way evolution works, there's never really a right or a wrong. It's what becomes kind of the adaptive or the approach that winds up kind of, quote unquote, winning out in the moment. And so I think part of what we ultimately may see is an ability to kind of come back to other perspectives that ultimately may be more valuable, more egalitarian, may be able to kind of create a society which isn't quite so competitive and may be able to, lift everyone up in a way that is much more valuable and a much better way than having this much more hierarchical structure. But it is interesting. I mean, there seems to be even within animal species, there are groups of both. Within human beings and different civilizations, there have been groups of both. So I try to cover that by sort of talking about what those different elements are. And that's also what I meant a little bit when I was talking about, I should probably clarify a little bit about my term, the use of the word myth. We talk about myth in the context of anthropology. Often we sort of think of myth in a very bad way, like the ancient Greek myths, and they were, not real. But myths really refer to stories, ways in which we understand the world. And so there are ways of trying to understand the world in many different kinds of contexts. So whatever that particular approach is, whatever that particular story is, that's part of what our brain, our rituals and so forth really help us to connect to. And then that can become what is the underlying sort of ideologies that inundate a given group or a given society. So I sort of talk about all of that and how we can think about that, and how they kind of interweave together as we start to explore those different biological bases. And your final point about, you know, religions kind of looking at sexuality in kind of a kind of a negative way, I guess, which many of them do. That's actually almost I think that's the title of my last chapter, which is, you know, should religion be afraid of sexuality, because it certainly seems to act that way. And I try to argue that it doesn't have to be that way, and that there may be ways really of embracing sexuality and spirituality. And so, but, you know, talking a little bit about why that seems to have happened and how we may find a way out of that. So thank you. All your points are great points.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. Excellent question. Lindsay, come on board.
Hey, thank you, Andrew. That was amazing. I'm like a bit of a fangirl of yours.
Oh, thank you.
Work on mystical states. I was curious if there's anything unique you see around practices that have a sexual component versus just like spiritual practices. Like, is it the same as meditation, as flow states, as psychedelics, as speaking in tongues, or are there like distinct, are there any noticeable differences when there's a sexual element involved?
Well, that's a great question. There's always certain similarities and certain differences to answer you quickly. But as with everything that always seems to happen in my life and in the world of science, it's always a lot more complicated than that as well. So part of what we saw in the context of our study in orgasmic meditation, which may be the quickest answer to your question, is that while we see certain areas of the brain that seem to be affected, that we also have seen in other types of meditative practices, like changes in the parietal lobe and the frontal lobe that are associated with that sense of oneness and a sense of sort of surrendering and connecting and so forth. There were also some changes that occurred in some very core areas of the brain, which have been looked at as being involved in sexual arousal and sexual experience. Now, interestingly, they are different. It does not look like, you know, just sexual arousal either. That is a very different kind of look than what we saw in the orgasmic meditation study. So, you know, to me, orgasmic meditation really does represent a kind of true hybrid. It's kind of utilizing that sexual energy, so to speak, which kind of then drives these higher areas. But then the experiences that you can have ultimately do have a lot in common with the spirituality, and that hence the argument of it's kind of the same basic platform that you're working on. But you also raised to me what's one of my favorite topics, so to speak, in this whole field that's called neurotheology, which is, I really think about it as this big jigsaw puzzle. And so there are many different avenues that you can get to, you know, that you can kind of go down to get to different spiritual experiences. And they, you know, you mentioned a whole bunch of them: psychedelics and near-death experiences and meditation and orgasmic meditation and so forth. So there are many different pathways to these kinds of experiences. And what I've actually tried to elaborate in our research is this very complex network of structures that, depending on what you do, you kind of connect in different ways. And so, you know, if you're doing a meditation practice, a sort of a pure concentration meditation practice where you're just concentrating on something, you know, concentrating on an image, well, that's a little bit more of a top-down kind of process. You know, you're just kind of using your frontal lobes, you're concentrating on the object, and then you start to generate all these changes. I think that what's interesting about sexual experience, you know, using sexual energy as part of that process, is it kind of drives the process a little bit more from the bottom up, so to speak, because it's coming from your autonomic nervous system. It's affecting some of these very core areas of the brain, like the hypothalamus and the thalamus and the brainstem, which really regulates sexuality. But then as they then kind of connect up into the brain, you can kind of lead to these same kinds of processes. And in fact, that's part of how rituals themselves work. I mean, the whole actual process of the mating ritual is that it starts by, creating that connection, creating that identification. But as it proceeds, the rhythmicity is what ultimately leads to sexual peaks, sexual climax or orgasm. And so that the whole process can unfold. And then that's part of what also drives that whole experience. So I think there's a tremendous amount of overlap between all of them, but there also can be, unique elements. And I think part of what can be helpful is, there are ways of facilitating these experiences. So one could make the argument, would you rather, spend 30 years in a Zen monastery meditating on, a Zen koan about one hand clapping until you find enlightenment? Or would you rather, try to jumpstart the process, if you will, by using some other avenue that might be faster? And I think, something like sexual energy might be able to do that. Certainly the Kundalini approaches and the tantric yogas and so forth utilize that approach with an orgasmic meditation similarly, to try to do that in a way that facilitates that experience. But there are lots of different ways of doing that. So, but that's a great question. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Lindsay. Next, we will go to Leah.
Hi, Andrew. Thank you
Hi,
so much. It's good to see you. I'm so excited for this talk and for your book. So you mentioned before that when we have experiences where our parietal lobe is lowered, like an ohm, that it affects our relationship to the rest of the people in our lives or our culture or society. Can you just say more about that and what you specifically have seen there?
Yeah, so it's actually thank you for the question, because it's actually, again, one of my favorite topics in this whole field of neurotheology. Because what's interesting is that and I hate to say things that sound hierarchical, but I will for a moment here, which is that there seems to be a continuum of unitary states. And we've all experienced a lot of them. It starts with kind of, where we are in our everyday life. Well, we feel, a little bit connected to our society, to our friends. Then, and I'm cutting out a lot of the points along the line, but, you can have a romantic relationship. And so you feel a little bit more intimately connected with another individual. You can feel connected to your community, to a spiritual community. And then, if you go, sort of, so to speak, far enough along that continuum, you can have a feeling of oneness of all things, or a oneness with God, or oneness with, some universal consciousness or something like that. So part of what we think is going on is that, as the parietal lobe loses its activity, it's something called deafferentation, where you begin to, prevent activity from getting into the parietal lobe. It starts to, blur that boundary between the self and other, and then you can feel that sense of connectedness. And it's interesting because, and I tried to make this point a little while ago, which is that, I could just be me doing a meditation practice and feel connected to the universe. So, it's nice if you're in a group of people to feel, that sense of social connection. But that, a small group of people can still feel connected to all of humanity or all of the universe. So there's a bit of a movement along this continuum, which is a very important part of this whole process, and probably has a lot to do with the activity levels that are going on in the parietal lobe. And one other answer to your question, which may be also kind of where you're going to, is that there's a little bit of evidence to suggest that on the left side, because we have a left and a right side of our brain, that the left parietal lobe may be a little bit more about the self and the self-other relationship, whereas the right side may be a little bit more about objects in the world. So presumably, if you have a decrease of activity in the left parietal lobe, you kind of lose that sense of self, and your self becomes, you have that feeling of connectedness. But if you lose the right side, that you also have a sense that, all the objects in the world kind of evaporate, so to speak, and then everything becomes a oneness. So there are different, parts along this unitary continuum that become part of the experiences that people have. So, a practice like orgasmic meditation might be something where, you feel incredibly connected with the individual. If the practice, if you do the practice many times, you may feel connected to humanity. again, you can still have those same levels of spiritual connection with something greater than just the two individuals who are involved in the practice. But that's part of what's going on. But then again, that parietal lobe activity and what you feel connected to is, that's where some of the other parts of our brain become part of that process, because you might feel connected to God, you might feel connected to, a group of people. It really depends on what your overall perspective is. And the greater, the larger the group that you feel connected to, presumably the greater sense of love and compassion you have for, if you have a sense of connection to all of humanity, then you feel that sense of compassion for all of humanity. Whereas if you keep yourself limited to a small group, that's where things can sometimes go wrong. And I actually talk about this in the book as well, which is that sometimes when you get a sense of connection only within a small group, then the outside world can, you can start to get into an us versus them mentality. And that's where, we talk about rituals as being, wonderful and feeling a sense of connection. But what Jean DeQuilly and I used to talk about too, we had one of our favorite statements that we would make is that rituals are a morally neutral technology. And so they can be used for great good, but they can also, unfortunately, be used for great evil. And, we've certainly seen that in, throughout history. And the Nazis were terrific at using ritual, but obviously for very, very bad purposes. So rituals can kind of cut both ways. And that's the same thing with sexuality, the same thing with religion. I mean, sexuality is a wonderful thing. And it's it really embodies, for religious people, it embodies the connection that we have with God and in our connection with another. But obviously sexuality can be used for very terrible things and abuse and so forth. And religion can be wonderful and help connect people and find, charity and altruism and compassion. But unfortunately, people can also kill people in the name of God as well. And so, again, I try to talk about all of those and where all of those different pieces and elements can come from as we look at this interplay between sexuality and spirituality.
Those answers were wonderful. Thank you.
Great session. Really appreciated all that you had to say. And so, everybody, we have a new book coming out, Dr. Andrew Newberg, Sex, God, and the Brain. It comes out August 6th. We have to end our talk for now, but I want to make sure that everybody gets the ability to pre-order this book. As Dr. Andrew was explaining and answering his last question, I think that it's something very positive, a positive contribution to the discussion around humanity, religion, sexuality, and consciousness, and a great contribution. So if you get a chance, please pre-order the book now. We will also be doing another one of these webinars on July 18th, and then again August 6th when the book is released. So you will be getting more information about that. And again, Dr. Andrew, thank you for an amazing discussion. I'm so excited about your book. It's one of the best things I've read in quite a long time. And so we all wish you the best of luck.
Well, thank you. Thank you, everyone. Appreciate it and look forward to many more conversations.
Bye, everybody.